Welcome back to Learning PHP. Now in today's tutorial we're going to be looking at variables and constants. Now in the last tutorial we did cover data types and part of that we did assign variables values, but I didn't really go into the syntax of it at all, and I definitely didn't cover any constants. So in this tutorial we're going to be looking at the whole concept of variables and constants and the syntax around them. Now, what's the difference essentially between a variable and a constant? Now, a variable is a mutable value which can change whenever you need it to change. Constant is just basically the polar opposite of this, which is a value that cannot change and is completely immutable. So let's first have a look at the syntax of a variable. Now, a variable is simply defined by what's referred to as the dollar symbol. Well, referred to it is just the dollar symbol, and then followed by the name of the variable, an equals, and then a value. So let's break this down a little bit more. So dollar obviously is just signifies the definition of a variable. My variable is the variable name, and it must basically start with a letter but can contain letters, underscores, and numbers. You then have the equals, which is the assignment operator, which is basically saying whatever precedes the equals, I want that to be assigned to my variable. A value is just our string, which is going to be assigned to our variable. And then finally the semicolon, which is our termination operator, which basically, this whole thing that we're doing now in this syntax is an operation. We're assigning a value to a variable, and that is one operation, and you must terminate each of these with a semicolon, but I'll cover that a little bit more when I cover control structures in PHP. So how do you find a constant value? Now there is actually two ways of doing this. The first is to do a define using the define function within PHP, and the second is to define a constant within a class. But I'm going to cover classes as a separate tutorial, and therefore I'm not going to cover constants today within classes. I'm just going to cover them using the define mechanism. So what's the syntax of a constant? As you can see here, we're calling this function define, and the first parameter is a string, the second parameter is also a string, and then we're terminating it with a semicolon, as you would do. So let's break this down a little bit more so I can explain each part. So define is the function name that we're calling, and it's basically the function that creates the value in memory that we cannot change. The open and close brackets around the two values here are our function parameter boundaries. So in this case we take in two variables, and we're encapsulating those within our brackets. This is basically signifying that this is the constraints of the function. Name is a little bit different from a variable, because with a variable we just had a dollar and then the variable name. With a constant, using the define mechanism, we actually define it within the scope of a string. So this could be double quotes, single quotes, or here dogs if you so please, but I wouldn't advise doing that. And then we have a comma, which is basically the separation of parameter boundaries for a function. So for instance, this is the first function. This is the first function parameter, which is a string. Now to separate that from the second string, you use a comma. I'll go into strings a little bit more because there's things such as string concatenation where this can get a little bit confusing, but for now I'll leave it there. The second value is obviously the value that we're assigning to our constant, so our constant is called name, and we're assigning the string value of, well, basically value. And then finally the termination operator, which is basically just saying I've finished this operation. Now I know you can see probably in the tutorial slides, I'm cutting off a little bit with the webcam at the bottom right here. Basically what I'll do is I will upload the slides in online and then basically share them as part of the YouTube tutorial. So if you want to see those, they are in the description box down below. So let's have a look at this in code. Okay, so let's jump out of the presentation, and just so you know, I've actually started a Docker container within this project. Now, just a little side note: if you're running any other Docker containers within this tutorial, you must stop them before you run this one. So in the readme.md, I've given you a little instruction on how to stop a Docker container. So to stop the container, just run docker compose stop, and to remove it, you can just simply remove docker compose rm once the Docker container has stopped. Now that is a readme in every single one of the tutorials, so if you want to have access to it, just feel free to read it. So the next thing that we're going to do is start looking at some variables and constants. Now Let me first refresh this page because I was running through this tutorial previously just to give myself a little bit of a demo. Which is also why I have this error reporting at the top there. Now, I do have to state, I haven't really covered comments, and a simple way to understand what a comment is, it's just basically a bit of code that's not going to get interpreted by the PHP interpreter, and the reason for that is it starts with a double forward slash. This is a way that you can document your code if you choose to basically explain what your function's doing, what each operation is doing, and so forth. There's a couple of ways to define comments. You can either have a double forward slash, you can open a comment with a forward slash star, which then creates what's known as a dot block. Well, actually, the correct definition of a dot block is a double star and then a star and so forth. And that's a dot block, but that can also be defined like so as well. But that's enough for comments for now. So let's have a look at defining some variables. So variable, as basically the slide presented to you, we could have my variable is equal to a value, and basically terminate it with a semicolon. So we've just assigned a variable with the value a value. We could do a couple of other things. Obviously we could assign my int to equal an integer. We could do my double to equal 4.4. Just a side note, I didn't cover when I was covering the data types. You can also use f to define that it's a floating point number, but by default it does that anyway. I've just noticed I probably haven't zoomed this in far enough, so let me just zoom in a little bit more to make it slightly bigger. I hope that wasn't too small. Now, obviously, we have a variable, and my variable, my int, my double. We can do a couple of other little tips and tricks when assigning variables as well. So, for instance, if I wanted to assign two variables to the same value, I'd do my first variable is equal to my variable, which is equal to a value. So, if I was to call or echo out, echo my first variable, it should print a value, like so. Make sure you can see that. Let's even as big as it can. And if, for instance, I wanted to reference a variable based off a variable's value, I can do that with a double dollar. Now, what I mean by that is, let's just say my value is equal to 22, and I create a variable. So let's call this ref variable. Equal to the string my value. This might be a little bit confusing for some people, just bear with me. So I want to actually just print out 22 using the reference I have here. But if I print out just my let's just copy and paste this ref variable, it will print out my value. But I can actually take this one step further by putting in another dollar sign. And what I'm doing there is basically defining the boundaries of the variable name by so. So I can either do this one of two ways. I could do it with just double dollar and then ref value, which is basically saying, look at this, then look at this value here, and then I want to assign it to that variable, or I want to print out or get that variable, which in this case will print out 22. You can make it a little bit clearer by having the open close curly braces, which will basically just say the variable name is actually a variable itself, being the value of ref variable. So again, in this case, we'll print out the value 22. That's quite useful if, for instance, you've got an array and you want to loop over, say, a form that has lots of different variables that you assign at a variable level. Generally, most people don't use this. I don't in my day-to-day work. The form is the only thing I can find an actual use for. So, for instance, if you had an object which you needed lots of variables assigned locally, that would be a great way of using it. But for the most part, that's pretty much it. So that's pretty much variables in a nutshell, apart from I haven't really covered the reassignment of a variable, so I'll just do that quickly now. So if I want to do a reassignment of a variable, we already have my variable. So if I echo out my variable, we should have a value. If I set my variable to another value, echo it out again, it should basically have a value followed by another value. So now my variable is equal to another value. So if I just print that out, we'd only ever have another value. So let's have a look at constants then. Sorry. So in constants, we define it as we did in the presentation. Define, and then my constant, and then my value. So if I echo that out. Now, side note, with constants, you don't actually have to reference them with a dollar because it's not a variable. So if I were to print that out, echo my constant. Why did that not print out? There we go. For some reason it just didn't save. My constant is just printed out my value. Now, if I do the same example I did before, where I reassigned the variable, so if I take define my constant to another value and echo out my constant, you'll notice it hasn't actually changed. It's still my value, even though I'm stating here to assign it to another value. So if I comment that out, it's still my value. Now what's actually happening there is there's a notice being kicked out that you can't see that's basically telling you can't reassign it. So if I uncomment out the error reporting, basically state error reporting all, basically what this does is state what errors to actually surface, or what level of errors to surface when you're doing your PHP or running your PHP at runtime. A lot of people don't generally like having all errors being displayed, especially on a production environment, because sometimes notices and warnings aren't that bad and essentially don't do anything. Like in this case, it's not actually breaking anything, it's just things aren't functioning as we'd expect. And really, you probably can't see that well, so hopefully that was a little better. We should stop cutting all the end off. So if I do that, because of the error reporting being enabled, I'm basically saying show me all errors, I don't care what it is. We're basically getting a notice saying that my constant is already defined on line 31, and basically we can't redefine it. So if I were to change that to constant 2, we get basically it running fine, and if I were to call it, it just basically work. Just a side note as well, you can also assign constants to variable values, if I'm correct. And that just basically takes the exact value. So for instance, if you were to basically try and change that value, so you go 1, 2, 3, then print it out, it would still have the default value, because it'll just clone the value at that time rather than using it as what's known as a reference point to basically always display the value of the variable. And that in a nutshell is variables and constants within PHP. Now I hope you found this tutorial useful. Next time I'll try to cover control structures within PHP, and I'll catch you next time.